Hey, how we doing, fellas? So I wanted to have a little chat here about a video I saw by Mikey D TFT. The video is called The Biggest Baits in TFT Set 10. I'll throw the video up on screen now, and in the description you can find a link to it, top link. Premise of the video was Mikey was discussing several items in TFT that are currently being built a lot, and so they have high usage, but they are not placing well. So their placement, as in like top 4 versus bottom 4, is very poor. We've got some examples on screen here. Prince's Rageblade is the prime example. The play rate here, 3.55 out of 8. That means out of 8 players in a game, 3.55 of them on average are making the Rageblade. On the cross side, placement is 4.33 average. Now that may sound decent, but TFT has a 1.0 is a win, 8.0 is a loss, is 8th place. So you want to be above 4.00 to be a good placement, as in like averaging winning versus losing. So you can see here, placement for the Dunce's Rageblade. It's being used a lot, almost 4 out of 8 players in the game are using it, and on average, those players are getting bottom 4, 4.23. Same with a few others I'll point out here. Jewel Gauntlet, Spirit of Shojin, and Titan's Resolve was another one I saw, especially if you go on the data and check Plat Plus. So sort this by placement for craftable items. Titan's Resolve is doing very badly in high ranking games, so Plat or above. Rageblade's still doing poor in this ranking, Jewel Gauntlet's still doing poor, Spirit of Shojin's still doing poor, Bloodthirster as well, not doing great. So the premise of it is that these items are not that good, but what Mikey was also discussing was some items that were doing good and weren't being built much, and you should be using them. Here's a short little view of them, but Morellonomicron is a great one here, but you can get an idea. But what Mikey was talking about himself in the video was, oh, now I'm in the wrong data set, I'm in Plat, Silver. Down. He was talking about Steadfast Heart, and he was talking about Crown Guard as 2 great items. Reasoning being, their usage is pretty low. On average, barely above 1 player in a game is building a Steadfast, yet it is placing top 4 pretty consistently, 3.76. On the other side, you have, Crown Guard. 0.88, less than 1 player is building this average per game, but it is on average placing top 4. So again, you're seeing some pretty interesting stats here. What I do want to point out though is something I noticed looking through the data set here, a bit of survivorship bias in some of these items. And it is most commonly seen in Thieves gloves, so I'll use that as the prime example here. So let's check the Thieves gloves for a second. You have 1.49 out of 8, a bit over 1 player on average builds it. It is placing 3.78 average, so top 4's pretty good. Win percentage 18%, pretty good again, and one of the highest here on the list actually. But if we go and look here on the right, top users of the item, you have Kiana, you have Alawi, you have Yorick, and then you have Viero Erdrot as well. You can probably already pick out something from these units that a fair amount of the time they're just units you would throw a Thieves Gloves on, because you don't really have them itemized. If you're running a Samira comp, for example, you may not itemize Erdrot, because you hit him a lot, you might have him 2-star, maybe you even got him 3-star, but you didn't itemize him. Same thing with Viego, maybe you're running Karthus, you're doing a Pentakill Edge Executioner build, and you just have a Viego in for your Pentakill, but you're not itemizing him even though he's strong. 5 costs as well fall into this. If we check here, in the top usage, we go by place, the top units are all 5 cost aside from Thresh. Now, this is not uncommon. You're going to see this a lot, regardless of what item. If I go back to these items here, I click Rageblade, for example, go place. Mostly 5 costs up here. Tanks not as much, but even tanks somehow are doing better. So that's not uncommon. You're going to see that within all items. 5 costs are always going to do better, and that's because they're stronger units, and they're going to place better because you get them later in the game. But what's really interesting here is the usage rate. So as I just touched on a little bit, 5 costs are always going to have a higher placement inherently, because players do not get 5 costs until they are placing good already. And what I mean by that is because you only get them at level 7 if you're very lucky. If not, usually level 8 or 9, they'll happen more. So by the time you are level 7, 8, and 9, you're gonna be in a position where you are probably top 4ing already, if not very close to it. If you're level 7 and you high roll, of course you're not gonna be, but if you're level 8 or level 9, you have a decent board, you're gonna be top 4ing. So regardless, a 5 cost unit is always going to be on the higher end of the placements for every item in the game. What's interesting here though is the play rates. So the placement number here, 3.78, I double checked the numbers myself, I did the math. This number is based on not the average of the placements here. It's based instead on the average of the placement based on the play rate. And that inherently makes sense, right? If you find a unit that has 1% of the usage, you don't want them to count the same amount as a unit that has 7% of the usage, like Yorick here. So that inherently makes sense, we can all agree. But what's important to note here is the combination of the survivorship bias of all these 5 costs inherently doing better with any item, along with how much these 5 costs up here and Thresh are using these gloves, right? 3%, 5%, 7% Yorick, 5% Thresh, and it's understandable why this happens, right? You get late game, you get hit level 9, you throw in a 5 cost to make your board stronger, you get a Thieves glove maybe from Carousel, maybe from Dragon, maybe you just had leftover items at 5-1, you slammed a Thieves glove, right? That makes sense. But again, the position is, if you're late game, you're gonna have one of these units anyway, you're gonna be in a position to top 4 when you get this Thieves glove, and you just slam it anyway. And because you slam it on the stronger units, that inherently makes this look better for Thieves gloves, right? So all of these strong units have high play rates with Thieves glove, and they obviously have a high placement, because not only are they strong units with any item, but you only get them when you're in a position where you're going to place top 4 anyway. So the numbers here are already very skewed for Thieves glove, right? You have like 7%, 10%, like 20. There's a solid 25% here, all in the above 3.34, purely because these strong units that you get late game very often end up with a Thieves glove. And that makes sense, that's perfectly understandable. However, when you're just looking at the numbers like this, you scroll down here, see, not many people build gloves, 3.78 placement, this is a good item, I should be building this. And that's definitely not the case, because the numbers, they look good, but this is an absolute opposite of what you want to do in game. And I mean that as in, if you have 2 gloves at 2-1, you never want to build Thieves gloves unless you have the augment that makes Thieves gloves better. But you never want to be building this of your own volition early game. This is like a slam it on a carry late game and have them do a little extra damage on the side next to your main carry. And that's pretty inherent for Thieves gloves. I feel like most people understand that. But having it up here, you can kind of get an idea that the same concept might apply to some of these other items, right? You check out Steadfast Heart, for example. Placement? You can ignore some of these outliers like Sona, Kiana, blah blah blah, because they're not really inherently good user units and they have low play rates, right? That makes sense. But if you focus on the high play rate units, it's just the good tanks that any item would be good on. 7.62 with Nalawi, 4.71% usage with Yorick, and they have good placement, of course. But that's just inherent, as in you would always slam a good a tank item on one of these people late game, and that makes sense. Then you come down here and it's a mixed bag of placements with different units, blah blah blah. And the placements aren't bad, but you get the idea that on tank units it's being slammed more, decent placements. But the 5 costs, especially the higher end, is what's tilting the viewer. And I feel like a fair amount of this can be attributed to not building these items early. And what I mean by that is touching on survivorship bias again. A lot of people aren't building Steadfast. That's inherent from the data. We see that here. Go back to place, craftable items. Steadfast, one average being built a game, right? So we're not seeing many Steadfast Hearts in a game. And you can imagine from this that if people aren't making Steadfast that much and people don't see it as a strong item, when are people often going to pick it up, right? It can be in a position where you can't choose the item you're building. So an example can be 5-1 late game when you only have 2 items left from building your items. Another example can be a late game carousel where Steadfast is one of the items of the 8 and you need a tank item. Another example again, Dragon, you get an item anvil late game and you need a tank item and you don't have many other options. So it's just worth thinking about. The play rate being low can attribute directly to the placement being higher, just because the lack of it being built is directly tied to when it's used in game, right? If you're not building it early, the people that are getting it are more often getting it later game, and therefore it's inherently going to place higher than everything else here on the list. Similar thing with like Crown Guard, right? Same sort of item, tank item, you go place, you go by percentages, allow a 5% high, Yorick 3% high. It's inherently strong units. And I think a good telling one here is Thresh, right? 3.53 Thresh, 5.45% used, 20k games. And if you're paying attention to the current meta of TFT right now, Thresh is a good unit, but he's not like your main tank you want to itemize, right? You'd usually have, if you're running like Guardian, you might reroll a Mumu and you might itemize him, like here. Or late game, you might have a Yorick example, and you might want to itemize him if you have Guardians in, because Yorick's very strong. Even in country, Thresh isn't like being itemized all too often as like a main item carry. Yet, if you go through the items, you can see some of these outliers, like Morello doing really well on him with 0.5%, Steadfast, even Sterex, and I wouldn't think to build Sterex, personally. 4,000 games here, where it's been used, 4.06 placement. Because again, it's that situation of you just have an item and you slam it on this unit because it works late game. You're not building the item early, and therefore the item itself isn't particularly strong. Now, of course, all of that isn't to say that these items with low usage, high placement are bad. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's worth thinking about this data set with a bit of, think of it with like a pulled out perspective, you know? The numbers themselves don't tell the whole story, even though it looks really good. That's just what I wanted to touch on from some of the things Mikey said. Don't take what he said as in it's bad from what I'm saying. A lot of the points he made, for example, Rageblade being bad, that's a perfectly valid point. It's been built a ton, and even though it's been built this much, people aren't figuring it out. It's been placing pretty low on average. So you probably shouldn't be building this all too often. But you can take your own knowledge from this, you know? You can look through these data sets. Tactics.tools is the website. You can take a look, read through the numbers, sort them however you want to, and you can just get a decent idea based on play rates alone how these items stack up. At red buff here, 6%, 3% Ziggs, Lucian, 4% blah blah blah. But then the placements look good here, but if you sort by play rate, again, Lucian's up top still, 4 cost to Charlie up top. And then Ezreal 4 cost, Jhin 5 cost. And then the outliers here are obvious things like Twitch reroll, Samira reroll, Urgot reroll, things that are pretty strong or being used often in the meta right now. Even so, these play rates are so high on these 4 and 5 costs that it tilts the data, because these items that you get late are either good or you're just slamming them on 5 costs, and they have such high play rate comparative to everything else. Because I do believe red buff is in a good state right now, but you would imagine that an item that's this good would have a higher play rate on different units aside from a 5 cost, if that makes sense. You wouldn't think that a 5 cost would be the highest play rate of an item. I haven't checked how this stacks up with everything else. Like here, great example. Play rates on Warmugs. Nico, Echo, Blitz, Pantheon, Amumu, blah 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 blah. Alawi's all the way down here, 6%, still higher, but everything else is a lot higher. 4 cost as well, Blitzcrank, 3rd place, and then no other 4 costs until Thresh and Zac down here. The idea being that the units were, the items were 5-4 cost, topping the play rate will proportionally affect item placement, because often what's happening is these are just items that work on the unit well, that you're getting in late game and just slamming them, as opposed to good items that you're building early. So yeah, I've rambled on for a bit, but I hope you get the idea. It's just a way to look at the data, take it with a bit of a grain of salt, and just think about placement rates and play rates as a connected item, and rather than individual. Because placements can look great on their own, but they don't tell the whole story. And a lot of the time, these can just be late game slams that look good in the data that you should never be slamming early. So yeah, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a great day and good luck in your games.